A millionaire took his maid to his fiancée's wedding, but she does something that changes his life forever. The invitation arrived in a pearly envelope with gold lettering, like a bomb disguised as a present. Christian Palmer stared at the luxurious paper in his hands, feeling each word cut like a small blade. Madison Bennett and Richard Cooper invite you to celebrate their union. Madison Bennett, his ex-fiancée, the woman who only 8 months ago had called off their wedding to be with her partner. And now, in an act of supreme insensitivity, or perhaps calculated cruelty, she was inviting him to her wedding to Richard. Sitting in his penthouse office at Palmer Financial Group in Manhattan, Christian swiveled his chair to take in the panoramic view of the city. The New York sky seemed to mock him with its perfect blue, unsuited to his gloomy mood. "Mr. Palmer?" The soft voice of Victoria James, his housekeeper, interrupted his bitter thoughts. "You have a meeting with the investors in 15 minutes. Victoria was standing at the door, her uniform simple but impeccable, her brown hair tied up in a discreet bun. She had been working for him for almost 2 years, managing his penthouse and home life with a quiet efficiency that he appreciated. She was the kind of person who could move around her surroundings without attracting attention, almost invisible until that moment. "Victoria," he called out, a sudden idea forming in his mind. "Do you have an appointment for next Saturday?" She blinked, surprised by the unexpected question. "No, sir." "Good. You'll be my date to Madison's wedding." Victoria's eyes, a peculiar shade of amber, widened slightly. "Excuse me, sir." "My ex-fiancée's wedding," he explained, standing up and adjusting his Hermes tie in the reflection of the window. "I need someone presentable and discreet by my side. You fit the part perfectly." Victoria hesitated, a faint blush tinging her cheeks. "Sir, I don't think it's appropriate. I'll double your salary for this month," he interrupted, his voice taking on the tone he used when closing deals. "And I'll provide a suitable dress for the occasion." The silence that followed was tense. Victoria lightly pressed the folder she was holding against her chest. A gesture he had already noticed was a sign of her discomfort. "Why me?" she finally asked. Christian smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Because you're the last person Madison would expect to see by my side. She's always made a point of treating my employees as invisible. It'll be interesting." Victoria straightened her shoulders, and for a moment Christian glimpsed something in her posture that intrigued him, a dignity that went beyond her role as housekeeper. "You want to use my presence to provoke your ex-fiancée?" she pointed out, her voice calm but firm. "Pretty much," he admitted, seeing no reason to deny the obvious. "So, do you accept?" Victoria studied him for a few seconds, her gaze surprisingly penetrating. "Yes, Mr. Palmer, I accept." Over the next week, Christian immersed himself in work, trying to ignore the anxiety that grew in his chest as the wedding day approached. He sent Victoria to Bergdorf Goodman with his credit card, instructing her to choose something appropriate for the occasion. What he didn't expect was the transformation he witnessed when she appeared on his doorstep on the day of the wedding. The midnight blue dress she had chosen was elegant without being ostentatious, hugging her curves gracefully. Her hair, normally pinned up, fell in soft waves, framing a face that, free from its usual discretion, was surprisingly beautiful. "You look appropriate," he commented, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt to disguise his momentary bewilderment. The walk to St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue was silent. Christian could sense Victoria's silent disapproval, but that only made him more determined. She couldn't understand the humiliation of being changed, of having her trust betrayed. As they entered the church, all eyes turned to them. Christian noted with satisfaction the whispers and surprised expressions. Madison, who was greeting some guests, froze momentarily when she saw him with Victoria. "Remember," he murmured to Victoria as they walked to their seats, "you're here to play a part?" Victoria nodded slightly, but there was something in her expression that made him wonder if she had her own plans for the evening. What Christian Palmer didn't know was that his revenge was about to turn into something completely different from what he had planned. The organ began to play the wedding march, and as everyone stood up to welcome the bride, Christian felt Victoria's hand lightly touch his arm. It was a simple gesture, but strangely comforting. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to wonder if all that staging was really worth it. But then Madison walked past him, radiant in her white dress, and the moment of doubt dissipated. The game was just beginning, and Christian Palmer intended to ensure that this would be a ceremony that no one would soon forget. What he didn't imagine was that the most unforgettable person that night would not be Madison, Richard, or himself, but the silent woman next to him, whose secrets were about to change his life in ways he could never have predicted. The ceremony proceeded like an elaborate theatrical performance, with Christian maintaining a studiously casual smile as he watched Madison and Richard exchange their vows. Victoria stood serenely by his side, her presence strangely comforting amidst the maelstrom of emotions he was trying to suppress. When the reception began in the Plaza Hotel's luxurious ballroom, Christian led Victoria through the hall as if she were a princess, not his housekeeper. He introduced her to important executives and old friends with a particular pleasure in seeing Madison's bewildered expression every time she looked at them. "Are you enjoying your little show, Mr. Palmer?" Victoria asked softly as they danced a waltz, her voice carrying a note of disapproval that bothered him more than it should have. "Why wouldn't I be? It's going exactly as planned," he replied, spinning her around with rehearsed precision. Victoria held his gaze. Maybe because revenge rarely brings the satisfaction we expect. Before Christian could retort, the master of ceremonies announced that it was time for the special presentations to the bride and groom. Madison had always loved being the center of attention, and Christian had expected to have to endure honeyed speeches from close friends. What he didn't expect was to see Victoria discreetly get up and walk towards the grand piano in the center of the hall. "What are you doing?" he whispered urgently, grabbing her wrist. "Something that should have been done from the start," she replied with disconcerting calm, gently releasing herself from his grip. Victoria sat down at the piano, and the room fell into a curious silence. She adjusted the microphone and, with a simplicity that contrasted with the ostentatious atmosphere, began to play the first notes of Conti per Tiro, and then she began to sing. The voice that emerged from the woman Christian knew only as his efficient housekeeper was something transcendental. It was a voice that could make angels weep, rich in emotion and technically flawless. The entire hall froze, mesmerized by the unexpected performance. Christian felt his heart skip a beat. In 2 years, he had never known, never imagined. He watched as Victoria sang with her eyes closed, her expression serene, as if she were in her own world. The song spoke of departures and new beginnings, of leaving the past behind and finding the courage to move on. Madison and Richard, the supposed targets of her revenge, seemed as delighted as everyone else. The tears in the bride's eyes were genuine, and Richard hugged her lovingly as they listened. When Victoria finished, there was a moment of stunned silence before the hall erupted in applause. She rose gracefully, bowed slightly, and dedicated the song to the couple, wishing them well with a sincerity that made Christian feel small and petty. "Where? How?" he began when she returned to the table, unable to formulate a coherent question. "I studied at the Juilliard Conservatory," she replied simply, taking a sip of water. "I was a soloist at the Metropolitan Opera for 3 years. And now you're my housekeeper?" The incredulity in her voice was palpable. The look she gave him had a depth that made him realize how little he knew about her. "Life rarely follows the paths we plan, Mr. Palmer. Sometimes our choices are dictated by love, not ambition." At that moment, Christian saw his carefully planned revenge crumble like a house of cards. Victoria hadn't just stolen the show, she had completely transformed the meaning of the evening. Where he wanted to create embarrassment, she brought beauty. Where he planned humiliation, she offered grace. The rest of the evening passed like a blur. Christian watched Victoria interact with other guests, many of whom were opera connoisseurs and recognized her from previous performances. She answered questions with modesty and discretion, without ever revealing that she now worked as a housekeeper. During the journey home, the silence in the car was different from the one on the way out. Christian felt unprepared for the first time in a long time, not in control of the situation. "Why didn't you ever mention it?" he finally asked when they pulled up in front of his building. Victoria stared out of the window for a moment before answering. "You never asked, Mr. Palmer. Sometimes the most interesting people are those we consider invisible." She said goodbye with a soft nod and got out of the car, leaving Christian with more questions than answers. As he watched her enter the building, he realized that his mysterious housekeeper had not only sabotaged his revenge, but had also aroused a curiosity in him that he hadn't felt for a long time. What else was she hiding behind that professional facade? And why would someone with so much talent choose a life so different from her potential? Christian realized that he was about to discover that some stories are much more complex than they seem at first glance. The morning after the wedding, Christian couldn't concentrate on his work. The image of Victoria at the piano, her voice filling the hall of the Plaza Hotel with transcendent beauty, occupied his thoughts. He scoured the internet, finding old videos of her performances at the Metropolitan Opera. Victoria James, the revelation of the 2018 season, hailed as one of the most promising sopranos of her generation. Mr. Palmer? The familiar voice startled him. Victoria was standing outside his home office, holding a tray of breakfast. Dressed again in her discreet uniform, it seemed impossible to connect her with the dazzling singer from the night before. "Why did you stop?" he asked abruptly, turning his laptop so that she could see the video of his performance of La Bohème. Victoria placed the tray on the table with precise movements, her composure unwavering. "My father was diagnosed with ALS 3 years ago. He needed full-time care. There are nurses for that," Christian argued, realizing too late the insensitivity of his words. A sad smile crossed her lips. "Not everyone has your fortune, Mr. Palmer. Besides, some decisions aren't based on practicality alone." Christian stood up, walking over to the window that offered a panoramic view of Central Park. "Where is your father now?" "He passed away 8 months ago," she replied softly, "but I don't regret a single moment I spent with him." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken revelations. Christian turned to face her, really seeing her for the first time. "Why continue as a housekeeper after that? You could go back to the Met." Victoria adjusted a napkin on the tray, a gesture that betrayed her unease. The opera world isn't very forgiving of career breaks. 3 years is an eternity. Besides, she hesitated. "Looking after a house, keeping things in order, that brings me a peace that the stage never did." "Nonsense," Christian declared, his voice taking on the decisive tone he used in negotiations. "You can't waste a talent like that. I have contacts on the Met board. I can make some calls." "Mr. Palmer," Victoria interrupted him firmly, "I appreciate the offer, but I don't need charity." "It's not charity," he insisted, stepping closer. "It's investment. You have an extraordinary gift, Victoria. What happened last night? It was magic. You turned a petty attempt at revenge into something meaningful." Victoria studied him for a moment, her amber eyes penetrating. "Why does it matter so much to you?" The question caught him off guard. "Maybe because I need to do something good to make up for my bad intentions yesterday," he admitted, surprising himself with his honesty. A slight blush tinged Victoria's cheeks. "You don't owe me anything. You owe art," he argued. "To the world. To yourself. And what exactly are you proposing?" Christian felt the familiar excitement of when he was about to close a big deal. "Give me 6 months. Keep working here, but allow me to arrange private lessons, contacts with the right people. If after that time you still prefer to be a governess, I'll respect your decision." Victoria hesitated, and Christian could see the conflicting emotions on her face. "Why would you do that for me?" "Because yesterday you showed me that there are better ways of dealing with pain than revenge," he replied, surprised again by her sincerity. "Let me repay you." The silence stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Finally, Victoria nodded slightly. 6 months, she agreed. "But on one condition." "What?" "You have to come to all my classes and rehearsals," she said, a small smile playing on her lips. "I need someone to carry my sheet music." Christian laughed, a genuine sound that surprised him. "Done." As Victoria left the office, Christian realized that there was something different in the air. An expectation, a possibility of change that went beyond simply helping his housekeeper resume her opera career. Something was beginning there, something that neither of them had planned or anticipated. Picking up his phone, he began to make calls. The first would be to Madame Dubois, a renowned singing teacher who owed him a few favors. It was time for Christian Palmer to use his resources for something other than making money and nursing grudges. What he didn't know was that this decision would change not only Victoria's life, but his own, in ways he could never have imagined. Victoria stared at the imposing facade of the Metropolitan Opera House with a mixture of nostalgia and apprehension. 3 weeks had passed since the wedding, and Christian was keeping his word with a determination that surprised her. Madame Dubois, one of the most respected singing teachers on the East Coast, had agreed to coach her after a single phone call from him. "Are you ready?" Christian asked, appearing at her side with a cup of coffee in one hand and a folder of sheet music in the other. "I still can't believe you actually came to carry my sheet music," she commented, trying to disguise her nervousness with humor. "A Palmer always keeps his promises," he replied, a genuine smile lighting up his face. Victoria noticed how different he had seemed in recent weeks, lighter, less bitter. Madame Dubois' studio occupied a room on the 3rd floor, overlooking Lincoln Center. The teacher, a woman in her 60s with impeccable posture and keen eyes, examined Victoria like a jeweler appraising a precious stone. "3 years is a long time, ma chérie," she declared after hearing Victoria sing a few scales. But the voice is still there, waiting to be rediscovered. The next few hours were intense. Madame Dubois was relentless, demanding perfection in every note, every breath. Christian watched everything from the corner of the room, occasionally making notes on his phone. "Why are you taking notes?" Victoria asked during a pause. "I'm learning about your world," he replied simply. "How can I help if I don't understand?" That answer caught her off guard. The Christian Palmer she had met 2 years ago would never have shown such interest in the life or career of a female employee. After class, as they walked through Lincoln Center Plaza, Christian surprised Victoria again. "I have a proposal for you," he began, stopping near the famous fountain. "I want to turn the rooftop music hall into your rehearsal space. It's practically abandoned anyway." "Mr. Palmer, Christian," he corrected. "I think after watching me carry your sheet music for 3 hours, we can dispense with the formalities." Victoria felt her cheeks heat up. "Christian," she tried again, "I can't accept it. You're already doing too much. Consider a mutual investment," he insisted. "You need a place to practice and I've discovered that I like listening to you sing." The October wind blew a leaf between them, and Victoria caught it in the air, twirling it between her fingers. "Why are you doing all this?" "The truth, please." Christian was silent for a moment, watching the tourists take pictures at the fountain. "When you sang at that wedding," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I realized how much time I'd wasted nurturing resentment. You turned a moment that should have been about revenge into something beautiful. Maybe I want to be part of creating more moments like that." The honesty in his voice touched her deeply. "What about your work? Surely you have more important things to do than follow my lessons." "I have very competent assistants," he smiled. "Besides, I found that a few hours away from the financial reports can do wonders for your sanity." Victoria laughed, a clear sound that echoed around the square. "All right," she agreed, "but on one additional condition." "What?" "You have to learn at least one aria with me." The comic horror on his face made her laugh even harder. "I don't sing," he protested, "not even in the shower." "Everyone can sing," she insisted. "Some people just need more encouragement." Christian stared at her for a long moment, and Victoria noticed something change in his eyes, as if an invisible wall was starting to crumble. "A duet," he finally relented. "But if anyone but you hears me, you're fired." "I promise to keep your musical secret safe," she teased, feeling inexplicably lightheaded. That evening, as Victoria organized the kitchen after dinner, she reflected on how her life had changed in just a few weeks. The sheet music she used to keep in a box under her bed now occupied a place of honor on her bedside table. Her voice, dormant for so long, was starting to wake up, eager to fly again. And then there was Christian. The man she had known only as her distant and sometimes bitter boss was turning out to be far more complex and interesting than she had ever imagined. There was a vulnerability about him that emerged at the most unexpected moments, such as when he closed his eyes during his vocal practices or asked questions about breathing techniques with genuine curiosity. The sound of the elevator announced his arrival, and moments later Christian appeared in the kitchen, still in his suit, but with his tie loosened. "I've been thinking," he began, pouring himself a glass of water. "How about we start with O Sol Mio? It seems simple enough for a beginner." Victoria almost knocked over the drying plate. "Have you really researched Arias?" "A Palmer always does his homework," he replied with a mischievous smile. "Besides, I need to maintain my reputation as an exemplary student." At that moment, watching him clumsily leaf through a score he had taken out of his pocket, Victoria felt something change inside her. It was as if the universe was conspiring to create a whole new melody, one that neither of them had planned, but which was beginning to sound surprisingly harmonious. A month after starting lessons with Madame Dubois, the music room in Christian's penthouse had been transformed. The grand piano, once covered in a fine layer of dust, now gleamed in the natural light coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Organized sheet music occupied elegant shelves, and a full-length mirror had been installed so that Victoria could observe her posture during rehearsals. "Breathe from your diaphragm, not your shoulders," Madame Dubois instructed, her hands gesturing emphatically as Victoria practiced a particularly challenging passage from Un Bel Dí by Madame Butterfly. Christian watched from his armchair in the corner, fascinated by the transformation taking place in front of him. Victoria, in her element, was a completely different person from the discreet housekeeper he had known. When she sang, she radiated a magnetic confidence that left him speechless. "Your turn, Mr. Palmer," Madame Dubois suddenly announced, making Christian choke on his coffee. "Pardon?" "Victoria told me about your agreement," the teacher smiled mischievously. "And it's high time we started your O Sol Mio lessons." Victoria tried to hide a smile as Christian reluctantly stood up, adjusting his tie as if it were a suit of armor. "Relax," she whispered as he positioned himself next to her. "Nobody expects you to be Pavarotti on the first day." "Good to know," he murmured back, "because at the moment I feel more like a cat being strangled." The next 2 hours were a mixture of frustration and discovery. To everyone's surprise, Christian had a reasonable musical ear, although his voice needed a lot of work. Victoria watched with amusement as he, always so controlled in his multi-million-dollar negotiations, became completely unhinged when trying to hit a note. "It's not so bad," she consoled him after Madame Dubois had left. "You're a terrible liar," he replied, pouring 2 glasses of wine. "But I appreciate your attempt to preserve my ego." Victoria accepted the glass, noticing how natural it had become to share these moments with him after school. "Do you know what else needs practicing besides singing?" "My dignity?" "Your waltz," she replied, placing her cup on the piano. "If we're going to do a duet eventually, you need to learn to move with the music." Before he could protest, Victoria turned on the sound system, and the first notes of The Blue Danube filled the room. "I don't know if it's a good idea," Christian began, but Victoria had already taken his hand. "Posture," she instructed, guiding him into the correct position. "And 1, 2, 3. The first steps were awkward, with Christian trying not to step on her feet. But gradually, as the music flowed, they found a rhythm. Victoria noticed that he was a fast learner, adapting naturally to the movement. "Where did you learn to dance like that?" he asked as he spun her around. "Musical theater in high school," she revealed. "Before I decided to dedicate myself to opera. Are there any other hidden talents I should know about?" Victoria smiled mysteriously. "Maybe, but some discoveries are better made slowly." The music changed to something slower, but they continued dancing, the closeness creating a bubble of intimacy that neither of them was prepared to acknowledge. "Victoria," Christian began, his voice softer than usual. The shrill ring of his phone broke the moment. Christian pulled away abruptly, checking the screen with an expression that mixed frustration and relief. "I need to take this," he muttered, already heading for the office. "It's about the deal in Seattle." Victoria nodded, ignoring the sudden emptiness she felt when he walked away. She walked over to the window, watching the lights of Manhattan begin to glow in the twilight. What was happening to her? With them? Minutes later, she heard his footsteps returning to the lounge. "Sorry about that," Christian said, looking a little uncomfortable. "I have to travel to Seattle early tomorrow." Urgent matters with one of our biggest investors. Of course, she replied, keeping her tone professional. Should I cancel the lesson with Madame Dubois? No, he answered quickly. Keep practicing. I'll be back in 3 days. Victoria nodded, starting to collect the sheet music. The intimate moment of minutes ago now seemed like a distant dream. Victoria, Christian called out as she was about to leave the room. When I get back, maybe we can continue that dance lesson? She turned, meeting his eyes. There was something vulnerable in his gaze, something that made her heart race in a way she didn't want to examine too closely. Of course, she replied softly. After all, you still have a lot to learn about rhythm. He smiled, and for a moment Victoria glimpsed the man behind the carefully constructed walls, someone who, like her, was discovering that sometimes the best melodies in life are the ones we don't plan. As she walked back to her room in the staff quarters, Victoria found herself humming O Sol Mio. The song that was supposed to be just a simple lesson was turning into something much more meaningful, a bridge between two worlds that, until then, had seemed irreconcilable. What neither of them realized was that, while they were concentrating on notes and dance steps, something deeper was being composed, a symphony of feelings that no score could contain. The flight to Seattle seemed endless. Christian tried to concentrate on the financial reports on his laptop, but his mind kept going back to the moment of the dance with Victoria. The way she guided him through the steps, the natural confidence in her movements, the soft scent of jasmine emanating from her hair. Mr. Palmer? The stewardess brought him back to reality. We're starting the landing procedure. In Seattle, the typical Pacific Northwest rain suited his contemplative mood perfectly. During meetings at the Palmer financial office, Christian found himself drumming his fingers to the beat of O Sol Mio, while other executives discussed projections and graphs. Everything all right, Christian? Asked Marcus Wheeler, his vice president, after a particularly long meeting. You seem different. How different? I'm not sure. Less intense? You didn't even discuss it when Thompson suggested those changes to the Vancouver project. Christian adjusted his tie, a gesture that now made him think of Madame Dubois' posture lessons. Maybe I'm learning that not all battles need to be fought. Back at the hotel that evening, he surprised himself by checking the Seattle Opera House schedule. There was a performance of La Traviata on. Before he could stop himself, he bought a ticket. During the performance, Christian found himself completely absorbed. Now that he understood more about vocal technique thanks to his lessons with Victoria, he could appreciate the nuances of the performances in a whole new way. Each aria, each duet seemed to tell a deeper story than he had ever noticed before. In the interval, her phone vibrated with a message from Victoria. Madame Dubois says you're due a breathing lesson. And don't think I've forgotten our unfinished dance. An involuntary smile appeared on his lips as he typed the reply. Watching La Traviata in Seattle. Maybe we should add Semper Libera to your repertoire? Ambitious. But first we need to work on your C major scale. The exchange of messages continued during their stay in Seattle. Victoria would send audios of her rehearsals, and Christian would reply with comments on the performances he'd see. It was a new dynamic, unlike any relationship they had ever had, professional or personal. On the morning of the third day, while having coffee in the hotel restaurant overlooking Pike Place Market, Christian received an unexpected call from Madame Dubois. Monsieur Palmer, we need to talk about Victoria. The teacher began without preamble. There is an audition next month for a new production of La Bohème. I believe she's ready. Christian felt his heart race. Does she know about it? Non. Victoria still doubts her talent. We need to convince her. Why are you telling me this? There was a significant pause. Because you're not just her boss now, Non. You care about her. Christian observed the bustle of the market below, fishermen organizing their goods for another day's work. What do you suggest? Get her to audition. She'll listen to you. After hanging up, Christian canceled his afternoon meetings and anticipated his flight back to New York. There was something more important he needed to do. He arrived at his penthouse just after midnight, but the lights in the music room were still on. The sound of the piano floated down the corridor. Victoria practicing, even at that hour. She stopped playing when he entered, surprise evident on her face. I thought you weren't coming back until tomorrow. I needed to talk to you, he said, dropping his briefcase and loosening his tie. About the audition next month. Victoria tensed. Madame Dubois told me. Why don't you want to do it? She got up from the piano and walked over to the window. The city sparkled below, millions of lights telling their own stories. What if I'm not good enough? 3 years is a long time, Christian. The opera world doesn't forgive. Nonsense, he interrupted her, stepping closer. You're extraordinary, Victoria. I saw how people reacted at the wedding, how Madame Dubois speaks of your talent. Why can't you see that? Because, she hesitated, turning to face him. Because sometimes it's safer to hide behind something familiar than to risk everything for a dream. Christian took another step towards her. As your employer, I order you to audition. Victoria arched an eyebrow. Are you using your authority to manipulate me? No, he smiled. I'm using my authority to prevent you from making a mistake. Besides, he held out his hand to her. You still owe me a dance. The sound of their laughter mingled with the melody that still echoed through the hall, creating a harmony that seemed predestined. As they danced, Christian realized that Seattle, with all its rain and operas, had only served to confirm what he had already begun to suspect. He was falling in love with his housekeeper, and from the gleam in Victoria's eyes as she moved in his arms, perhaps he wasn't the only one facing this startling revelation. Victoria was spending extra hours in the music room, preparing for her audition for La Boheme. The character of Mimi demanded not only vocal excellence, but also an emotional depth that challenged her to confront her own fears and insecurities. Your high notes are perfect, Christian commented one afternoon as he watched her practice. But there's something holding you back. Victoria stopped her practicing, turning to face him. Over the last few weeks, he had become surprisingly perceptive about her music. What do you mean? Mimi is a character who lives intensely, even though she knows her time is limited, he explained, moving closer to the piano. She allows herself to love, even if it means suffering later. You're singing technically well, but I'm protecting myself, she added softly. Christian nodded. Just like in real life. The comment hung between them, loaded with unspoken meanings. Victoria knew he wasn't just talking about her performance. I received an interesting invitation today. Christian changed the subject, sensing her discomfort. There's a charity dinner at Carnegie Hall next week. I thought it would be a good opportunity for you to meet some of the people there. Like your housekeeper? The question came out sharper than she had intended. As my accompanist, he corrected, his eyes meeting hers. Like a talented soprano about to make her triumphant return, Victoria felt her heart race. Christian, people are going to talk. Let them talk, he shrugged. But there was an underlying tension in his voice. Unless you care about that. It's not that, she sighed, taking a seat on the piano bench. It's just, everything is changing so fast. Sometimes I wonder if I'm ready. Christian sat down next to her, his fingers lightly brushing the keys. Do you know what I've learned over the last few months? That being ready is overrated. Sometimes we just need to take the leap and trust that our wings will work. Since when did you become so philosophical? She smiled, trying to ignore the closeness between them. Since a certain governess decided to teach me about opera and showed me that there's more to life than contracts and acquisitions. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the intercom. It was Madame Dubois, arriving for another lesson. The next few hours were intense. The teacher seemed to sense the change in atmosphere among her students, casting knowing glances as she made them practice a duet. You're both making good progress, she commented at the end of the lesson. But you need to learn to trust each other completely, in music and maybe in other areas too. After her departure, Victoria began organizing the sheet music, trying to ignore the teacher's suggestive comment. Christian watched her from across the room, his gaze thoughtful. About the charity dinner, he began, you don't have to answer now. But know that, whatever you decide, I'll be by your side on this journey. Victoria stopped what she was doing, absorbing the weight of those words. Why? Why what? Why are you doing all this? The classes, the contacts, this unconditional support. It doesn't make sense. Christian approached her slowly, as if afraid of scaring her. Maybe because, for the first time in a long time, something in my life makes sense. Seeing you get your music back, your sparkle, It made me realize how long I've spent just existing, not living. Victoria felt her defenses begin to crumble. What if I fail? What if the audition is a disaster? Then we'll try again, he replied simply. The important thing is that you're trying. You're allowing yourself to dream again. At that moment, looking into his eyes, Victoria realized that they were no longer just talking about music. There was something growing between them, something that made the line between employer and employee increasingly blurred. I accept, she said softly. What? The invitation to the charity dinner. You're right, it's time to stop hiding. The smile that lit up Christian's face made his heart skip a beat. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. Now, he said, his tone returning to its usual provocative tone, how about practicing that waltz one more time? I need to impress New York high society with my newly acquired skills. Victoria laughed, allowing herself to be pulled into his arms. As they danced to imaginary music, she realized that perhaps Madame Du Bois was right. Maybe it was time to trust in the music, in herself, and in the man who had unexpectedly become much more than her boss. The city glowed outside, a silent witness to yet another rehearsal that transcended musical notes, as two people discovered that sometimes the best compositions in life are the ones we don't plan. Carnegie Hall sparkled like a jewel in the Manhattan night, its golden lights reflecting in the windows of the surrounding buildings. Victoria nervously adjusted her emerald green dress as she climbed the historic steps alongside Christian, who looked impeccable in his tuxedo. Breathe, he whispered, his hand resting lightly on her back. You've faced much bigger audiences than this. Yes, but as a singer, she replied softly. Not as well, whatever I am tonight. The ballroom was packed with New York's elite. Victoria recognized several faces from the opera world: directors, patrons, critics. Some looked at her twice, trying to place her. Victoria James? A familiar voice made her turn. Gerard Montgomery, artistic director of the Metropolitan Opera, gave her a warm smile. My God, it's been so long. I thought we'd lost you forever. Mr. Montgomery, she greeted, feeling Christian tense beside her. It's a pleasure to see you again. It's my pleasure. And I see you're in good company. He looked at Christian with interest. Mr. Palmer, I didn't know you were a patron of the arts. I'm expanding my horizons, Christian replied diplomatically, his hand still protectively on Victoria's back. The conversation was interrupted by the announcement of dinner. As they made their way to their table, Victoria noticed the glances and whispers that followed them. Christian must have noticed her unease, because he brought his lips close to her ear. They're talking because you look stunning, he murmured. And because half of them regret letting you get away 3 years ago. Dinner passed in a haze of sophisticated conversations about music, art, and finance. Victoria watched as Christian skillfully navigated between subjects, always finding a way to highlight his talent in the right conversations. I hear there are auditions for La Boheme next month, commented a patron of the arts sitting opposite him. You should try, dear. Your Mimi was extraordinary. Victoria felt Christian's encouraging gaze on her. Actually, I'm getting ready to audition. The news circulated around the table like spilt wine, generating a wave of interest and approval. Gerard Montgomery, in particular, looked intrigued. When the orchestra began to play, Christian led her onto the dance floor. Months of practice had transformed her clumsy movements into something elegant and natural. You planned all this, didn't you? Victoria asked as they twirled around the room. All those right people at our table. Guilty, he admitted with a smile. But I only created the opportunities. You're the one who's shining on your own. Victoria rested her head on his shoulder for a moment, allowing herself to appreciate the sense of security he provided. Christian, yes? This thing we're doing, it's getting complicated, isn't it? He adjusted his embrace, pulling her a little closer. Life usually gets complicated when it's worth it. Before they could continue their conversation, Gerard Montgomery appeared at their side. Victoria, can I steal you away for a dance? We have a lot to talk about. Christian reluctantly released her, and Victoria followed the artistic director out onto the dance floor. Her heart raced when he started talking about possible roles and future opportunities. I always knew you'd come back, Gerard commented. Talent like yours can't stay hidden forever. And it seems you found a powerful supporter in Mr. Palmer. Victoria blushed. Christian has been incredible. Gerard watched her with experienced eyes. Just be careful, dear. Our industry can be merciless with gossip. It's nothing like that, she protested. But the words sounded weak even to her own ears. The evening continued, a whirlwind of music, dancing and connections being re-established. Victoria felt as if she were living in two worlds simultaneously: the familiar world of opera she had left behind, in the new world she was building with Christian. When they finally left Carnegie Hall, the city had been transformed. A light and unexpected snow was falling, transforming Manhattan into something magical and surreal. Do you want to go for a walk? Christian suggested, offering his coat. Central Park isn't far. Victoria accepted, and they walked in comfortable silence to the park. The snow muffled the sounds of the city, creating a bubble of intimacy around them. Tonight was perfect, she finally said, stopping by a snow-covered fountain. Thank you. Christian turned to face her, his eyes intense in the light of the street lamps. Victoria, no, she interrupted him softly, placing a finger over his lips. Not yet. I need to do this audition first. I need to know who I am without all this. He took her hand, kissing her icy fingers. Then I'll wait. But know that, no matter what the outcome of the audition, for me you will always be the woman who taught me to listen to music again. The snow continued to fall softly around them, each flake carrying promises of future possibilities. Victoria knew she was on the verge of a transformation, not just in her career, but in her heart. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't scare her. It was as if her whole life had been one long preparation for this particular aria, one that was just beginning to be written. The day of the audition came quicker than Victoria had expected. The Metropolitan Opera House, once her artistic home, now looked imposing and intimidating as she climbed the backstage stairs, sheet music clutched tightly against her chest. Take a deep breath, Madame Dubois' voice echoed in her mind. Over the last few weeks, the teacher had worked tirelessly with her, refining every note, every nuance of her interpretation of Mimi. The waiting room was full of aspiring sopranos, all competing for the same role. Victoria recognized some familiar faces from the past, noticing the surprised looks and whispers when they saw her. A young singer sitting next to her widened her eyes. You're Victoria James. I saw you perform Violetta in 2018. It was transcendental. Victoria smiled gently, remembering her own youth and nervousness at her first auditions. What's your name? Lucy. Lucy Gardner. Well, Lucy, remember, Mimi isn't just about perfect notes. It's about love, life, and the courage to embrace both, even if you know they're ephemeral. The words came out naturally, and Victoria realized they were the same ones Christian had shared with her during their rehearsals. He had become much more than a musical mentor. He was her safe haven, her anchor on this journey of rediscovery. Victoria James, the production assistant, called out, and the moment arrived. The stage was exactly as she remembered it, vast, majestic, and full of memories. In the audience, she distinguished the silhouettes of the selection committee, including Gerard Montgomery. When you're ready, Ms. James, his voice echoed through the theater. Victoria closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of this moment. 3 years ago, she had left this stage thinking she would never return. Now she was back, not just as a singer, but as a changed woman. The first notes of "Si, mi chiamano Mimi" filled the space. Victoria let her voice flow, each word charged with genuine emotion. As she sang about the little seamstress who finds love in the middle of the Parisian winter, she thought about her own journey, the choices she had made, the people she had lost and found. She thought of her father, who had always believed in her dreams. She thought of Christian, who had helped her rediscover them. When the last note faded into the air, there was a moment of absolute silence. Victoria kept her eyes closed, her heart beating hard against her chest. Extraordinary, Gerard's voice broke the silence. You haven't lost any of your technique, Victoria. In fact, you've gained something else: depth, emotional maturity. That's exactly what we were looking for in this production. The words took a while to register. You mean, the role is yours, if you want it. Victoria felt her legs go weak. One of the judges approached with a glass of water as Gerard took to the stage. "Welcome back, Victoria," he smiled, holding out his hand. "Rehearsals start in 2 weeks." Leaving the theater, Victoria was surprised by Christian waiting on the sidewalk, holding a bouquet of white lilies, her favorite flowers. "How did you know?" she asked, both about the flowers and the result. "I didn't know," he admitted, handing over the bouquet, "but I believed." "So?" "I did it," she whispered, still processing reality. "I'm going to be Mimi." The smile that lit up Christian's face made her heart race. Without thinking, she threw herself into his arms, the bouquet pressed between them. "Victoria," he murmured into her hair, "I need to tell you something." She pulled away slightly, meeting his eyes. "Yes? I can't pretend anymore that this is just about music or your career. These last few months, watching you blossom, listening to you sing, dancing together, I've fallen in love with you." Victoria felt the world stop. There, on the steps of the Met, where her artistic journey had begun and begun again, another chapter of her life was about to open. "This is going to complicate everything," she whispered, but she didn't move away. "Life usually gets complicated when it's worth it, remember?" He smiled, repeating his own words from the night at Carnegie Hall. "What about my job as a housekeeper?" "I think it's time for a career change, don't you?" he joked, but his eyes were serious. "Victoria, I want to see you shine on stage. I want to be in the front row at all your performances." "I want—" She silenced him with a kiss. Right there on the busy Manhattan sidewalk, the bouquet of lilies pressed between them, white petals dancing in the autumn wind. When they parted, both panting and smiling, Victoria realized that her life had been transformed into something that not even the most beautiful aria could describe. It was her own symphony, complex and imperfect, but absolutely her own. "So," Christian asked, entwining his fingers in hers, "ready for the next act?" Victoria looked at the Met, then at the man next to her, and finally at her own reflection in the nearby shop window, no longer a housekeeper pretending to be something she wasn't, but a woman who had found her true voice in every sense. "Yes," she replied, shaking his hand. "I'm ready." 6 months after her triumphant audition, Victoria was in her dressing room at the Metropolitan Opera House, preparing for her debut as Mimi. The mirrors reflected her period dress, carefully designed to capture the essence of the young Parisian couturier. On the walls, posters of the new production of La Bohème announced her return to the stage. A soft knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting to see her stage assistant. It was Christian, impeccable in his tuxedo, carrying a small blue velvet box. "I thought you might need something old and something blue," he smiled, approaching. "We're not at a wedding," she joked, but her heart raced when he opened the box, revealing a delicate sapphire brooch. "It belonged to my grandmother," he explained, pinning the brooch to her dress. "She was a great opera lover. She would have loved to see you sing." Victoria touched the jewel gently, touched by the gesture. The last few months had been a roller coaster of emotions and changes. She had quit her job as a housekeeper and moved into her own apartment on the Upper West Side, although she spent more time in Christian's penthouse than she liked to admit. "Nervous?" he asked, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Terrified," she admitted, but in a good way. "Like that first night at Carnegie Hall." "You're going to be extraordinary," he affirmed, kissing her forehead. "You always are." A new knock on the door announced Madame Dubois, who entered carrying a bouquet of white lilies. "Miss Sherry's, it's almost time." "My cue to go," Christian smiled. "I'll be in the front row, as I promised." After he left, Madame Dubois helped Victoria with the final adjustments to her costume. "You know," the teacher remarked casually, "in all my years of teaching, I've never seen such a beautiful transformation. In my voice, in your life, ma chérie. You've finally found your true music." The next few minutes passed in a blur of vocal warm-ups and final instructions. Soon, Victoria was backstage, listening to the orchestra begin the overture. The theater was packed. She had peeked through the curtain earlier, recognizing faces from the music industry, important critics and, of course, Christian, exactly where she had promised to be. When she entered the stage, The outside world disappeared. She was no longer Victoria James, the soprano who had abandoned her career for family love. She was Mimi, the young seamstress who, despite facing adversity, never lost her capacity to love and dream. Her first aria flowed naturally, each note charged with genuine emotion. Victoria realized that she now understood Mimi in a way that wasn't possible 3 years ago. Like her character, she had learned that love, whether for family, art, or a partner, required the courage to be vulnerable. In the interval between acts, there were already rumors in the corridors about her performance. Gerard Montgomery appeared briefly in her dressing room, his eyes shining with satisfaction. "You exceeded all expectations, Victoria. The Met missed you." The final act was even more intense. Mimi's death, always moving, gained new layers of meaning through her interpretation. When the curtain finally fell, the theater erupted in applause. Victoria barely registered the curtain calls, the bravos, and the flowers. It all seemed like a dream until, returning to her dressing room, she found Christian waiting with a single red rose. "You cried," she noticed, seeing his eyes still moist. "It's impossible not to cry," he admitted, handing her the rose. "You didn't just sing Mimi, you lived it." Victoria put the rose in a vase, along with the other bouquets that already crowded the dressing room. "Do you know what I thought during the performance? That Mimi was right. Some things are worth any sacrifice: family, art, love." Speaking of love, Christian took a deep breath, and Victoria noticed that he seemed strangely nervous. "There's something I want to ask you." "Christian." He knelt down, taking a small box out of his pocket. The ring inside was simple and elegant, with a single diamond that sparkled under the dressing room lights. "Victoria James, you taught me to listen to music again, not just in the notes of a piano or your incredible voice, but in everyday life. You turned my petty revenge into something beautiful, my bitterness into hope. Will you marry me?" Tears escaped from Victoria's eyes, smearing her makeup still intact from the performance. "Yes," she whispered, pulling him up. "1,000 times yes." The kiss that followed was interrupted by applause. Madame Dubois, Gerard, and some of the cast had gathered outside the dressing room, witnessing the moment. "Now," Madame Dubois declared with a mischievous smile, "that's what I call a grand finale." Later that evening, after the premiere party at the Rainbow Room, Victoria and Christian walked through Central Park under the stars. The ring on her finger caught the light of the street lamps, reminding her that she wasn't dreaming. "So," Christian asked, wrapping his arms around her, "what's our next aria?" Victoria smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "I don't know, but as long as it's a duet, I'm ready for any tune." The city was still alive around them, its own urban symphony of honking horns, laughter, and promises. Victoria thought about how life had curious ways of composing its music, sometimes through loss, sometimes through unexpected encounters, but always with the possibility of a new beginning. And there, on the same sidewalks where months ago she was just a housekeeper carrying a musical secret, Victoria James was finally in harmony with all her notes, past, present, and future.